Now, the doctrine of the flux, or Heraclitus' doctrine of the flux, has a very significant impact on Plato's view of the world. And it's the metaphysical consequences that put Plato into, you know, a very strange position, trying to figure out what the world is all about, what the status of the world is. And let's consider kind of an argument that comes out of this. It comes out of Heraclitus' doctrine of flux. Well, if the doctrine of the flux is right, everything we encounter in the world undergoes constant change, constant flux. For example, skinny Socrates and the fat Socrates, He's skinny at one point, eats a lot, becomes fat at another point. Well, if that first thing is true about everything we encounter, then for all the objects in the world, S, there's a characteristic F, or a property F, such that it's true that S is F, and it's true that S is not F, right? Because Socrates is undergoing change. Let's say that thing is Socrates, characteristic F being fat. Well, it's true that Socrates is fat, and it's also true that he's not fat, because he's constantly changing. But therefore, contradictions are true of everything we encounter, which is everything we encounter. That's not a happy consequences, because nothing can have contradictions truly attributed to it. So from 3 and 4, we kind of get to the conclusion that the material world is in some sense unreal. Okay, well, that's the doctrine, right? That was the big conflict between Heraclitus and the Milesians, the intellectual conflict. It's not as if they even lived at the same time, encountered each other, and got up, at the philosophers' debate and debated each other. But the positions they hold are in stark contrast. Why is that such a big deal for Plato? And I think the reason that we're going to see it's a big deal for Plato is, what is the greatest virtue for Socrates, Plato's teacher? Knowledge. It's also one of the virtues, one of the most important things that you should be doing according to Plato. But what does this have? What effect does this have on your knowledge, on epistemology, the theory of knowledge? And I think we're going to see there is a skeptical conclusion that's there. Let's think about it. Consider for another statement, slightly different statement. Socrates is bald. Well, Socrates, like everything else, is always changing. And if Socrates is always changing, then statements about the world are never really true. Okay? But wait a second. Remember, early in the semester, we spent some time thinking about knowledge and the conditions of knowledge. What is knowledge? True opinion with the proof, with the justification. Justified true belief. But in order to know something, it means that thing has to be true. So if statements of the world about the world are never true, we don't know anything. The conclusion of all this, and this is what bothers Plato, it seems that Heraclitus is right, but what do we end up? We end up in the position of skepticism. That is, we don't know anything about the world. Not a happy conclusion for Plato. Now that we've seen how this begins to sow the seeds of skepticism. Heraclitus's views begin to sow the seeds of skepticism. We're next going to turn to Parmenides, who finds a way, and remember at the outset we were talking about idealism. He finds something. It's not the material world that's going to be real, but it's going to be something else. And he kind of picks up from the same kind of considerations that Heraclitus has. And there's some debate as to, whether Heraclitus preceded Parmenides, whether he was a contemporary, lived at the same time as Parmenides, and whether, one really had an influence. They knew they were even involved with each other's doctrine. We're not worried about that. That might be an interesting question for historians, but we're worried about the philosophical points, and the philosophical points are in stark contrast. So now what we've seen is the Milesians' view that the material principle is right, and now we've seen where it leads us with Heraclitus's observations about the fact that things seem to be changing in the world, and we see he's given us some good evidence. So one thing to think about, well, which of these guys is right? Are the Milesians right? Or at least right in principle, not that water is the material cause of everything, or that everything is made of water. I mean, we saw there was some truth to that, not that it was that primordial mixture, the apiron, the thing that had all the opposites, the emulsion of all the opposites. Not that, and not air, and being part of the continuum of all those elements. But it's change, and if that's the case, and that seems to be the case because nothing seems to persist, so it looks like we really don't know anything about the world Heraclitus is, if Heraclitus is right.